When conditions in the environment change a little here or there, organisms and cells can make adjustments to make sure their internal conditions still allow them to function. Sensing environmental conditions and making adjustments is all about cell signaling. This is video 7.12 about homeostasis, the ability of organisms to maintain a stable range of internal conditions needed to support life. The video supports these objectives, so pause for a closer look. A good definition for homeostasis is shown right here. Homeostasis is when organisms and cells maintain a stable internal environment despite fluctuations in external conditions. Cells use receptors to detect environmental changes and signaling pathways to respond to those changes. Just think about all of the things in your body that need to stay in a normal range for you to function. Some examples are listed here. An easy way to wrap your brain around the communication needed for homeostasis is to make a template, like we've done in the past, so we can see the patterns that are true for all homeostatic signaling. Here's the template that I want you to focus on for homeostasis. Every homeostatic mechanism has 6 basic parts. These 6 parts, labeled 1 through 6 on this diagram, are the stimulus, receptors, control center, effectors, response, and set point. 3 of these terms have to do with the level of the parameter that the organism is trying to keep stable. Now, the set point is the normal level. Stimulus is a significant change from the normal level, and a response is the correction of the homeostatic mechanism or return back to the set point. The other 3 parts in this homeostatic template are the actual communicating cells or communicating body parts. The receptors are constantly measuring the levels and communicate this information to the control center. Now, the control center integrates all of that information from the receptors, comparing the levels to the set point. And if the current levels are too far from the set point, the control center signals to the effectors. Then the effectors initiate that corrective action to bring the parameter back to the normal range. Together, all of these homeostatic mechanisms work by negative feedback. Now, negative feedback is going to be slightly different here than what we learned about in the endocrine system with shutting down hormone production. In the case of homeostasis, negative feedback simply means that if a body parameter gets too far away from the set point, the body self-corrects to bring that condition back. I think it's best to apply our template to a couple of examples and see what I'm talking about. I like to think of homeostatic mechanisms in this diagram that looks like the number 8 right here. 8, like that. In the middle is the ideal spot, that set point. Environmental changes can cause the body to go too high above the set point, like up here, and then the body takes corrective action to decrease levels back to normal. Alternatively, changes can cause levels to go too low, in which case the body corrects itself to raise levels back to that normal set point. Let's take a closer look with this example of body temperature homeostasis. Now, you probably already know that the set point for body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And sometimes there's a stimulus when the body temperature rises too high. Thermoreceptor neurons are the receptor cells responsible for constantly sending temperature information to the hypothalamus. As the control center, the hypothalamus is in charge of comparing the current temperature to the set point. And once the hypothalamus senses that the temperature is too high, the hypothalamus sends signals to effectors to take action. When you're too hot, effector sweat glands make you sweaty, and your dermal or skin blood vessels open up to let blood near your skin, and your face can turn red. And as a result of these corrective actions by effectors, the response is that your body loses heat, decreasing the temperature back to the set point and correcting that change. All right, so what does this have to do with cell signaling? Which cells are the signaling cells, and how does all of this work? Well, if you remember that the receptors, control center, and effectors are the actual cells or tissues here, it becomes easy to see the cell communication. The receptors communicate information to the control center, and then the control center communicates signals to send that information onto the effectors and make a change happen. Let's check out the opposite situation when body temperature gets too low. Again, our set point is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees for all of you metric heads out there. But suppose you're waiting outside for the bus in some frigid weather. That environmental cold is the stimulus where body temperature drops below normal. Thermoreceptors, again, are the receptors that communicate temperature information to the hypothalamus control center. Now, if the temperature is too far below the set point, the hypothalamus will communicate with effector organs. In this case, we've got a couple of different ones. When body temperature gets too cold, the effector organs are the muscles and the dermal blood vessels and the sweat glands. And in response to signals from the hypothalamus, dermal blood vessels constrict, sending that blood from your skin to the core of your body. Sweat glands don't secrete any sweat, and muscles shiver to generate body heat. And together, the added action of all of these effectors acts to conserve body heat and make the corrective response of raising the temperature back to normal, back to the set point. But here's the thing, your body temperature is never steady at 98.6, shown by this red line here, but actually fluctuates around 98.6 throughout the day. And in fact, your body temperature is not at 98.6 more often than your body temperature is at 98.6. And you can kind of tell that by looking at this diagram. And this is because if you measure any parameter under the influence of negative feedback and homeostatic mechanisms, you'll see this oscillation or fluctuation around the set point. But never fear, if the levels get too far away, then negative feedback brings things back to normal. Sometimes overshoots, but then brings things back to normal. That's how homeostasis and negative feedback work. All right, so homeostasis kind of is negative feedback. In other words, constantly bringing your body conditions back to a normal set point. And there's a stimulus that's a deviation from the set point and signals are sent, and then there's a response that brings levels back to normal. The positive feedback over here is a different beast. Positive feedback sends conditions away from the set point. And here's how positive feedback works. So there's a stimulus, deviation from the set point. Signals are sent, but then the response is to drive conditions further and further away. And this goes over and over again, and conditions get further and further away from the set point. In other words, the deviation from normal is amplified. So positive feedback is actually pretty rare, and there are only a few examples in humans. So like fever with your body temperature is one, where your body is trying to increase its temperature higher and higher away from 98.6 to kill a pathogen. Another positive feedback loop happens in mothers right around the time of giving birth. Let's check that one out. Here we go, the actual act of childbirth. So here's a baby in the mother's womb that's ready to come on out and be welcomed to the world. Now, if the baby's positioned normally, the baby's head will start to push against the mother's cervix right here. Now, that's what's happening in this part of the diagram. So neurons in the cervix send signals to the hypothalamus. And then the hypothalamus, or in here it just says brain, but it's really the hypothalamus. Then the neurons shared by the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary gland secrete oxytocin into the blood, which is shown down here. Now, oxytocin travels throughout the blood and then binds receptors on the uterus. And then that oxytocin binding to muscle cells on the uterus causes those muscle cells to contract, which pushes the baby's head against the cervix, sending signals to the hypothalamus, which triggers more oxytocin release and more contractions and more pressing against the cervix. And the cycle goes on and on and on until those labor contractions cause the baby to come out. Here's that pathway shown another way with a diagram over here to kind of like go along with it. So the stimulus is childbirth, where sensory neurons in the cervix send signals to the hypothalamus, and that triggers oxytocin release by the posterior pituitary gland. Now, the oxytocin hormone travels through blood vessels to the target cells, which in this case are the muscle cells in the uterus. And once the oxytocin ligand binds receptors on the uterine muscle cells, those muscle cells contract, and that's the response that keeps the cycle moving away from the normal. Positive feedback. Another example with a lot of the same parts is breastfeeding. So, the stimulus for breastfeeding is the baby suckling against the mother's bosom. And then sensory neurons in the mother's breast sense the suckling and send information again to the hypothalamus. And that stimulates oxytocin release, so the same hormone here, the same signaling molecule. Oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary gland, and then now that oxytocin binds to receptors on different target cells, which are the smooth muscle cells in the mammary glands, and that causes those smooth muscle cells to contract and release the milk so the baby can eat. And this cycle continues. So the baby eating is the suckling that causes this to keep amplifying that signal, letting down more milk until the baby is done eating. So let's recap. Homeostasis, all about keeping those conditions at a stable state in an organism or in a cell. And maintaining homeostasis involves cell signaling between receptors, control centers, and effectors. Together, signaling between those parts can react to a stimulus and cause a response to bring levels back to the set point. That self-correction thing that's happening is called negative feedback. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is when a stimulus causes a response to go further away from the set point. Now, good illustrative examples of negative feedback and positive feedback are body temperature and labor contractions. So it's good to know the details of both of those as illustrative examples.